I think one of the things we're seeing in this presidential cycle is the consequences of not being more honest in our public conversations. And one way that that plays out has to do with race, very frankly. The fact that we haven't been honest about how whiteness shapes our American landscape allows people to be very racist in the way that they talk without us having a way to combat that besides suggesting that maybe they should just be more sensitive. What we should be doing is talking about how whiteness has determined who's considered qualified even when they don't have credentials, how whiteness shapes how people of color can be easily disqualified even when they do have credentials. By the same token, Hillary Clinton helps us see how not admitting how maleness is privileged in this society allows us to constantly see men as qualified and constantly see women as unqualified regardless of their credentials. So I think more honesty is needed in the public conversation, and that would allow for our political discourse to be much more honest and sophisticated. I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how much the way that we talk about people determines how they can be treated. So we see that going on in the presidential race when it comes to how easily we've gotten to a point where you can say something like immigrant and that automatically means something evil. You can say criminal and that automatically means people of color. So the way that you talk about people determines how poorly you can treat them. Hillary Clinton, of course, with her super predators comment that's been coming up in conversation again, is a powerful example of how if we talk about people in certain ways, we can then implement policies that devastate those communities that they're a part of. So it seems to me that being more honest about how easily we label certain groups and how even when people who are in privileged groups, such as white men, even when white men do things that are really damaging, like shooting up movie theaters and schools, that we never manage to have terms like criminal cling to them. So if we were more honest and we were more honest about assessing people's behavior rather than their demographic, maybe we wouldn't be in this constant stalemate. I think without question, Donald Trump has always represented what has been, unfortunately, the American way. And by that I mean that we assume that citizenship belongs to those who are white, male, and straight, especially if they have property. And his ideas are therefore not at all fringe. And the more that we pretend that they're fringe, the more dishonest we are about the nature of our country and about what we've always determined to be the true citizen that we all want to protect with our laws and our practices. So I think that Trump's popularity really holds a mirror up to our society and reminds us that we need to be honest about what our investments are. And unfortunately, our history shows us that in this country, very often you get considered competent, worthy, all of those things just based on demographics. So if we were more honest about that, maybe we would recognize how not fringe Donald Trump actually is. And I think, too, the fact that he's able to say the kind of deplorable things that he does, again, have to make us think about, well, how much are all of our policies and our most common practices aligned with actually calling people the horrible things that he calls them? So even if we don't overtly call someone a rapist, do we still have practices in this country that basically allow for certain populations to be grouped in negative ways, and other populations, even when they do negative things, they're not labeled that way? If our practices are doing that, then Donald Trump is simply being explicit about what we're allowing to be an implicit guiding principle. One of the things that strikes me as really important about African American voters and this cycle is the degree to which very often African American voters have been very conservative. They have simply wanted a place at the table. And so having candidates that are fairly conservative, fairly, middle of the road, like Hillary Clinton, can be very appealing to people who simply want a seat at the table. And I think part of what's powerful about this moment when we have Black Lives Matter really pushing our public discourse is that we're seeing more and more that young people in particular are understanding that simply wanting a seat at the table doesn't always get you what you want when that table is predicated on your dehumanization. So when you have a society that is perfectly okay with the constant killing of Black and brown people, and we're okay with it because we don't actually do anything about it, and our legal system allows those people, as long as you kill someone who's Black and brown, it really doesn't matter what color you are. The system is set up to make sure that you actually will not pay a price. So young people see this dynamic and they're saying, well, we can't simply push for a seat at the table when that table doesn't actually care about our humanity. What different strategies can we implement that actually will change the nature of the table? And I think that that's what Black Lives Matter has done. And so in this election cycle, we're seeing a real tension between Black voters who simply want a piece of the pie as it exists versus Black voters who really want radical change that Obama did not bring. The kinds of toxic conversations that we've seen this election cycle also have me thinking about how easily our public conversation around Barack and Michelle Obama always centered on a kind of negative perception of them. And this has been interesting to me because I study racial violence. And one of the things that I learned from writing my first book, Living with Lynching, is that very often you were lynched not because you were a criminal, but because you were successful. And as I've watched the way that the Obamas have been treated for the past 2 terms, it strikes me that their success is what inspires aggression from mainstream America. So despite being, Ivy League educated, despite him being married to one woman in a monogamous relationship, being a caring father, despite his being even-tempered in the face of unreasonable opposition, in some ways, his ability to exemplify everything that American society says it respects is the very reason why he's considered to be in need of being put back in his proper place. So how can we oppose him? How can we refuse to hear his Supreme Court nominees? All of these different ways of suggesting that he's not a legitimate president has really shaped the way that this entire administration has been received. And we see the same thing, I would argue, with Michelle Obama. The first time that you have a Black woman as woman of the house in a position of honor in the White House rather than as a servant, all of a sudden you have the immense popularity of the book and the movie, The Help. So that at that moment, there's a great reminder that, if you're feeling unsettled with this Black woman as First Lady, that makes sense, because the truth is Black womanhood belongs in a servant role. Remember those good old days when they were servants and they understood that they needed the guidance of white women? So it seems to me that those kinds of responses to having a Black first family indicate the underlying discomfort that American society has with viewing Black families as anything other than pathological. It's like if there's a Black family, there has to be something wrong with them. They can't possibly be the representative of all that makes America great. One of the things that I learned from writing my first book, Living with Lynching, is that very often you were attacked not because you were a criminal, but because you were successful. And so I started thinking about Black cultural production from slavery to the current moment and all of the examples of successful Black families and their households in these novels, in these dramas, in media and public discourse. And I've noticed very often that when you have a successful Black family, a lot of times the response is aggression. And so even when it comes to the Obamas, I've noticed that exact same trend. His being a loving father and husband, her being, as she says, mom and chief. But the response to their success in those roles has very often been aggression. So I'm actually looking at that dynamic in a new project called From Slave Cabins to the White House: Homemaking Anxiety in African American Culture.